We can start now.
We can start now.
Could we begin?
Yes, please.
Yes, please.
So now, good morning, everybody. And this is the third consecutive day that we are going to conduct the first session of the day. And with us today, we have a very distinguished speaker, Dr. Prakash, Assistant Professor of English from Central University of Rajasthan. Dr. Prakash is a young researcher. He has a number of publications in different reputed journals, and he's a very popular teacher also. So today he'll be speaking on mother courage. The text is prescribed in the 6th semester syllabus. So hope that this talk will be very engaging, entertaining, and thought-provoking. So over to you, Prakash, for your presentation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Please.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation, for the opportunity. And I think without having to waste any time, I'll just share my screen. Also, I'm going to time my presentation so that, I know how much time I have taken.
Oh, you have actually up to 12, you can continue. 1.5 hours.
Okay, all right. Fine.
Because our next speaker from the University of Rome will speak from 12.
Right. So, is my screen visible? Can I?
Yes, it's perfectly visible.
All right. Okay. Thank you so much. So the title of my presentation is "War, Violence, and Courage: A Study of Mother Courage and Her Children." I remember teaching this play roughly, I believe, 4 to 5 years back, and so it's nice to come back to the play once again. And in fact, we have a paper in our department which is basically 20th century literature, where we discuss primarily British literature, and we try to engage with poems, novels, and stories, keeping in mind the First World War and the Second World War. So what I'm going to do in my presentation, I'm going to begin with a few quotes from the play, so that we have a kind of a sense about the issues that I'm going to take up towards the end and throughout my presentation. And so after my first slide, which is basically about the quote from the text, Mother Courage and Her Children, I'm going to take up the background of modernism, what is modernity and modernism, and thereafter I will talk about English drama a bit. And of course, when you talk about Bertolt Brecht, we have to talk about epic theater and alienation effect. And then I'm going to plunge into the play. So these are some of the quotes, some of the lines that caught my attention when I was reading the play just a few days back. Once again, after I got to know about this lecture, and I'll quote: "To fall in a battle is a blessing, not an inconvenience, and why?" Scene 3, page 23. They are waging war, waging it for what they can. As a rule, you can say victory and defeat both come expensive to us ordinary folk. I tell you, there is nothing to stop the war. It's going on forever. The war will always find an outlet. Mark my words. The fault lies with those that start war. So just to briefly go into these quotes and then the background. So when you talk about war, something that I often discuss with my students whenever we do post-war paper in the 4th semester. And very interestingly, whenever we open this paper in the 4th semester, there is always some kind of a war that is going on in the background. So I have been teaching this paper for almost 5-6 years, and every time this paper is open for the students, there is some kind of a war that is going on in the world. And we often begin our classroom discussions with the very idea that how do we understand war? Do we see war as an extension of capitalism? Do we see war as something that generates revenues for nation states? Do we see war as a kind of a commodity? Do we see war in a sense which is highly material? And so when you look at war as a phenomena which is more about generating revenue, generating money, generating resources, then I believe we really then have to go into the very idea that do we really need war, and why is it that the human civilization always had to engage with war in some capacity or the other. Now, of course, when you talk about the new disciplines that are coming up within humanities, when you talk about post-humanism and transhumanism, if you talk about environmental humanities, all these different areas are in a way also critiquing human civilization in relation to war. And they're saying that human civilization is one of the most destructive species on the planet. It has brought havoc to the planet, to human civilizations, and not just human civilization. It has also brought havoc to non-humans. Now, when I was going through the Mother Courage and her children, very interestingly, in the play we have a number of references that not only talk about the human damage and the destruction of human life, but a number of lines also hint at the horses, the field of the farmers, the field of the working class, that of course is being ruined in the process of warfare. So when you look at war from these perspectives, then you tend to not only critique the very notion and idea of war, but also then question why is it that humans, and we claim to be the most intelligent, rational species on the planet, why is it that we haven't really brought a kind of a pause to war? And I think that is, the very first point that we can think about as we enter into the discussion. So if you look at these quotes, again, to talk about that, to fall in a battle is a blessing and not an inconvenience, and why? So again, in the play Mother Courage, and again, we see, how we always have this notion that if you die, in a war, it is a matter of blessing. It is not an inconvenience. So how we have, again, this very narrative of, dying in war as something which is an act of bravery and courage. Also, it brings honor. And so when you have these meta narratives and these grand narratives that project war, in such, a grand light, then often it becomes very difficult, to critique the very idea of war. Right. And when you say that, why do we need war? And then, of course, the next question comes that, OK, war is a matter of pride. War is about protecting the nation states. Right. War is about, protecting civilization. But if you look at, what war has done to us is actually the opposite. They are waging war, waging it for what they can get. So again, if you look at the backdrop of Mother Courage and her children, we have, the backdrop of 30 years war from the 17th century, which took place in Europe from 1618 to 1648. And this is a huge timeline. And of course, there are these lines in the play that the powerful people in the world would never really, get impacted by the war, even when the war is going on, because they are not really, positioned at the battlefront. It is always the poor people, the working class, that is going to be affected by the war, directly or indirectly. Right. So again, we will take up this entire class issue as we take up the discussion. As a rule, you can say victory and defeat both come expensive to the ordinary folk, something that I just said. I tell you, there is nothing to stop the war. It is going on forever. And of course, right now in the world, I think two primary, sites of conflict that we have, of course, Ukraine and Russia and Palestine, and Israel, and right now there is a huge movement that's going on in the West, in Europe, in US, where a number of students across institutions and universities are protesting against their own government to defund the war, to not really fund warfare. Uh, but very interestingly, and something that I often talk to with my students about, that when you lok at the nation states and the percentage of their GDP, and how much are they really kind of allocating in terms of military and warfare, it's rather very alarming, because a number of countries across the world, they have far rich, lesser budget for healthcare and education, and they have a far superior, higher budget for warfare and getting machineries and getting weapons. And if we look at the human civilization at the moment, we are perhaps the only species, civilization, on this planet which is heavily armed. So when we are living in a world which is heavily armed, it of course creates a sense of unrest. And this sense of unrest can really, really impact, the future. So while the timeline of Bertolt Brecht's Mother Courage and Her Children is from the 17th century, but I believe there is this element of universalism that you find in the play, where you can also somewhere position the play in terms of the present times, in terms of the present socio political realities, and the play will still make a lot of sense. So again, if you look at Brecht as a writer, he was somebody who was against violence, against fascism, Nazism, against any kind of a violent attempt on civilization, right? So again, as a writer, what he was trying to do, of course, the play came out during the 1930s. And this was the time when in Germany there was high unrest. Hitler was gaining a lot more power. There was a fair bit of control on the mass psychology by Hitler as a representative of the Nazi party or as a leader. So it was a highly volatile time. And in that time, Brecht was writing this play while the timeline of the play is from the 17th century. But again, the play is very much about what happened in the 20th century, what was happening, during the 1930s and even before in 1940s, and in what way the nation states were kind of in conflict with each other. The war will always find an outlet, mark my word, and the fault lies with those that start wars, right? So again, these lines then talk about that if we may try to stop war, we may try to curtail, the very progression of war, but then the war will always be relevant. And it will always be relevant because the war supports, capitalism, or vice versa. Capitalism wants war so that, it can sustain, right? And again, this critique is something that we will take up in the towards the end of the lecture. Right. So when you talk about 20th century, I think three key terms that become very important for us to understand, as students of literature, of course, are what is modern, what is modernity, and what is modernism. Now, modern is something that undergoes semantic shifts much faster. And modern is something, which changes on a daily basis. So yesterday's modern will not be today's modern. And in fact, Lionel Trilling quotes, the idea of modern can swing around in meaning until it is facing in the opposite direction. So we don't really have a unified understanding or definition of what is really modern, because modern as a term, as a concept, as a phenomena, it keeps evolving and it keeps changing. So what is modern today may not be modern tomorrow. So last year modern is not this year's. And modernity basically is the condition of being modern. So somebody, who's basically aligned with the idea of, who's really modern and what is not, right? So the condition of being modern is something that qualifies as modernity. If you look at modernity, we can divide it into three distinct phases. We can talk about early modernity from 1453 to 1789, classical modernity 1789 to 1900, and finally late modernity that is said to have started in 1900 and it lasted till 1989. And this is a rough kind of an outline. Modernism relates to the cultural activities that arise from modernity as a social condition in Britain. So again, if you look at modernism was a larger cultural movement that basically arose from modernity as a social condition in Britain. So again, in terms of modernism, it can get reflected in your thought, in your action, in your behavior. And of course, we had writings, we had paintings, we had architecture. How these different domains of society somewhere try to incorporate what is really modernism in the 20th century and the late 19th century. So again, the development of cities with mighty industrial empires and migration from rural to urban characterizes the concept of modernism. So again, if you look at 20th century and the late 19th century, there was a major shift concerning the cities, and of course industry played a very, very important role concerning the urbanization of cities in particular. Now, when you talk about modernism, and of course, I'm borrowing some of these terms from the reading, "The Name and Nature of Modernism" by Bradbury and Macfarlane, and the painting that you have is by Picasso on the left. So, modernism is something that has to do with shifts and displacements of sensibility. And what do we mean by this? So, again, modernism again has to do with a certain timeline wherein different sensibilities could be explored. You could engage with different way of thinking, and for example, if you look at Mrs. Dalloway's Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, so how that work is about bringing new techniques of writing, wherein we talk about stream of consciousness, which I believe is coming from William James, first time used by May St. Clair, if I'm not mistaken. So how Mrs. Dalloway, again, is an example wherein the sensibilities of all kinds are going through a drastic change. We talk about the change in terms of human relationship, the change in terms of human sexuality. Modernism is about crisis-centric centered view of history. It is about an abrupt break with all the traditions. So you break away from traditions and you begin something new, as well as it is about pluralization of the worldviews and the arrival of the new class. So if you look at the second bullet point, the crisis-centered view of history. So, and of course, pluralization of the worldview and the arrival of a new class. So when you talk about this very arrival of the new class, industrialization, of course, had a lot to do with the arrival of the new class, where you had a lot of people from the working class who were now working in factories, and also as part of different industries and factories that were coming up in cities, there was a huge migration from the country to the city, right? And so when that happened, now we had a new class. But even when we had this very changing landscape of society, the society was still going through a deep sense of crisis. Because if you look at 20th century, we had the First World War, and then we had the Second World War, and a lot of young people. And people in particular, they were highly disillusioned with the kind of damage that humans really had to go through in the name of war. And if you look at post-war societies, again, if you remember, and if you look at Wasteland by T.S. Eliot, published in 1922, and in the Wasteland, Eliot talks about this very crisis-centered view of history, where he talks about how the young people, they were lost and they didn't really know how to really make sense of their life, how to make sense of who they are, how to make sense of their, past as well as present and the future. Now, modernism also had to do with dislocation of beliefs and assumptions. Uh, and also, it was the time where you had a stylistic plurality, heterodoxy. There was a new disposition of time and space, right? And very interestingly, if you talk about what is this new disposition of time and space, and again, I would go back to Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, where um within the novel we have time where Virginia Woolf talks about time, which is historical time and also psychological time. So historical time is something that is linear, that is controlled by a clock, uh, and psychological time is more inner. So historical time is external, and psychological time is internal. It's more about your mind, and you're about more about your subconscious, right? How we have a clock of our own, and we don't really have to follow the linear time. So mind does not follow linear time. So then in the 20th century, this non-linearity of time became very important. Bradbury says it was about breaking away from familiar function of language, experimentalism and non-representationalism, and modernism is the art of modernization, right? So again, I think language over here then becomes very important, uh, wherein again we talk about how there was a break from the familiar function of language. So if you look at modern drama, uh, if you look at Painter's work, The Birthday Party and Waiting for Godot, the language works in a very different way, right? Where not necessarily language works as a trope of communication, right? And if you look at 20th century, there was this entire failure of communication, right? So if you look at the wasteland, in the wasteland the characters are not able to communicate, right? For instance, a lot of characters in the epic poem, they basically suffer with the lack of trust. They suffer with this lack of the very lack of the ability to communicate how they really feel. Now, before I also wanted to bring in some paintings just for everyone's reference here, right? And so again, the very first painting is and you can read out the names, which I won't be reading out, which I assume is visible to for everyone. So in the very first painting, which is uh, from the Impressionism, where we talk about the sensory effect of light. Then we have symbolism, where we talk about representing abstract or non-abstract. So how these symbols then become very important. And we again have over here this face of a human, and almost we can see this tear, which represents again some kind of an agony, some kind of a pain and sorrow, right? And of course we have this again non-human and human coming together, right? And then we have this third painting, which of course has to do with futurism. And futurism again was again a movement uh, within art which spoke about industrial cities, youth, violence. And this is the artwork called Battle of Light by Joseph Stella, right? So again, 20th century was the time wherein we had different art movements, different movements that had to do with painting, architecture, culture, writing, and how all these different movements, I believe, in one way or the other, were kind of incorporating each other, or in a way supporting each other. Also, when you talk about the modern drama also has to be seen as a kind of a theatrical movement, which was in continuation with, let's say, the writings and the other artistic cultural developments that were happening in the 20th century. Now, over here, again, we have other art movements, expressionism, cubism, and surrealism. And again, the first painting is basically an oil reproduction of the scream. I could not really find a good, image from Google, and it was so. I thought maybe I'll just incorporate an oil reproduction of the scream by Edmund Munch. And so again, if you look at these artworks, and again, expressionism had to do with the inner feelings through distorted rendition of reality, right? So I believe 20th century was a time where there was a whole discourse about, also the representation of the inner. I was just talking about basically how in Mrs. Dalloway, we have the representation of the inner time, right, which is a psychological time. So over here we can see the representation of the inner feelings. Also, talking about cubism, which is about geometric planes, right? And this is coming from Picasso, Women with the Guitar. And the third, of course, is by Salvador Dali, right? Where we can see the creative potential of the unconscious, right? And the artwork is called The Persistence of Memory, right? So again, we see over here expressionism, cubism, and surrealism, these different artworks. And you just give me a moment. Yeah. Right. So again, when you talk about modern drama, right, and so modern drama, it deals with real situations, real people located in real circumstances of everyday common life. Now, you may have to actually excuse me for a bit. I think there is somebody at the door who's been constantly ringing my doorbell, and I may have to just go, right, and I'll just be back very quickly. Just give me a moment. Sorry about that. Yeah. All right. So, yeah, I hope everything is visible. No disturbance whatsoever.
Yes, sir, it's all perfect.
Great. I'm really sorry because I think in between I lost my concentration because the doorbell was ringing continuously. Anyhow, so we are back now. So talking about modern drama, so again, modern drama had to do with addressing real situations and people located in real circumstances of everyday common life, right? And I think one example that, of course, we can draw here is from Look Back in Anger that I teach in MA fourth semester. And as part of that play, we talk about the everydayness of the working class and how the working class was trying very hard to change circumstances after the 1950s and after the Second World War. But the change was not really happening. The change was not really, coming along, and how that then added to, further a sense of hopelessness in terms of, the people and the community. Also, modern drama has to do with depiction of the common man who grapples or woman who grapples with the difficulties of existence, right? So again, this very question of existence then becomes very important when you talk about, the common man in particular. And again, we can in this regard, we can bring in, Harold Pinter's The Birthday Party, and how in The Birthday Party, again, we have these, characters, who are located in the everydayness of life, and how they are repeating the mundane, how they are repeating what they really kind of go through. So this form of drama can be addressed as anti-hero drama. And as I said, one example can be Look Back in Anger from Jonas by Jonas Bond, and how in Look Back in Anger we have the protagonist called Jimmy Potter. And Jimmy is somebody, who has got his degree from the university. He's a graduate, but he still runs this sweet stall. And he says that he runs the stall as an act of resistance, also because Jimmy says that there are no jobs for young people, especially people who are coming from, let's say, the working class. Now, very interestingly, when you look at the 20th century Britain, in 1944, they had this, Education Act, and as part of that Education Act, it was important in Britain for everyone to access education. So, what happened in Britain? In 1944, a lot of people managed to get education. A lot of people managed to go to colleges and universities, and of course get their degrees. But then those degrees did not really result into direct, employment, and that of course happened because there was this rampant class prejudice and class bias against people who came from the non-privileged, social backgrounds, right? Against the people, who did not probably dress up in a particular way, against people who perhaps did not speak in a particular way, right? And that is the reason why Jimmy is so very angry, and Jimmy's anger also is against the government, against also against the church, right? And he says that the church is trying to monopolize. And religion is trying to basically, divert the attention of the people, and divert the attention from unemployment, from hunger, from lack of job opportunities, right? And again, this very idea of religion comes up in Mother Courage, and her children, where we have the 30 years war, which is being fought between the Catholics and Protestants, right? So again, in the play we have a reference that, oh, this is a war of faith, right? And mostly the wars, are fought on the lines of faith, right? And but then also in the Mother Courage and her children, this reference comes up that there are no winners in a war, right? Nobody wins the war, right? Everybody suffers. And something that also the war poet, Wilfred Owen says, in his poem "Strange Meeting" or "Disabled," and he says that if you are a part of a war, it is going to impact you. It is going to disable you in one way or the other. It can be the physical disability, or we can talk about the psychological disability, or we can talk about, shell shock or PTSD that war, as a phenomena leaves behind in terms of people. Also, modern drama had to do with the use of theatre as a way of bringing about a change in social and political conditions. So how, then theatre is not only about entertainment, right? It is also about, commenting on the social and political, situations of the society, right? And very interestingly, when you talk about, the post-war society, in the West, so what happened, theatre, as a form, of art had heavily suffered because of the Second World War. So at least in the context of Britain, a lot of playwrights try to revive theatre, try to revive drama. They try to bring, people back to, see the plays. But and most of the playwrights, in fact, try to revive the classics. So many of them went back to Shakespeare. They tried to, again bring in this very traditional way of doing theatre, but that did not really work, right? And then, of course, we had a play like Look Back in Anger, where you don't really have props, and even if you do, these are not, highly well thought out props or curated props. These are the props that people use in their, living rooms. You didn't really have heavy costumes or expensive costumes. People were dressed up the way they normally dress up, or maybe they were wearing clothes which were not even ironed, so you just showed up on stage. And a lot of people were highly shocked, because they thought that this is not theater, because it just looks very ordinary, right? But then the young people could really connect with the modern drama, because it in a way was an extension of how they looked at the world and how they kind of thought about the world, right? So in fact, if you talk about Look Back in Anger as a play, and even if you talk about other modern dramas that came about, a lot of these plays and theatrical productions, they did not try to change the theatrical setup in order to appease the audience, right? They wanted to keep things as real as they could. They wanted to bring in that idea that theater is not really for your entertainment, but rather it is a tool of comment. Rather, it is a tool of social commentary and a political commentary. So again, when you talk about modern drama is essentially a drama of ideas, and so again, the ideas that would make the audience think. And at times, modern drama would be about engaging with the audience directly, having these conversations, which of course is very true about Brecht, how he brings in this alienation effect, which I'll be talking about in a short while, where the audience is talking to, where the performers, the players are talking to the audience directly. Now, also when you talk about modern drama had these elements of naturalism, realism, and absurdism, right? And I just thought that it's important to kind of bring in these three different components and elements before I move on. Right. So again, when you talk about the very idea of naturalism, right, so it was a theatrical style that attempts to resemble a real life on stage, right? Or somewhere, express or explain the real life, and real life like situations, right? Where so one major difference between naturalism and realism is that realism is about just being real on stage without having to have any explanation, or secondary explanation about it's just there on your face, right? But naturalism is about engaging, explaining with what is real life, and what are the issues of real society. In naturalism, actors are encouraged to use personal history to express emotions, right? So to bring in that element of personalization, and as well as what is real. Also performance that involves real life issues, right? So it may be a play about about, let's say, as I told you, unemployment. It can be a play about a very crisis of existence. It can be a play about the hostile working conditions. It can be a play about social prejudice and class prejudice. It can be a play about the failure of the government, right? It can be a play about the hollow nature of aristocrats and the and the privileged class, right? So all these issues would often be for instance, could be picked up. Also, naturalism is about accurate characterization, right? So again, the focus is on the accurate representation, and there is a deterministic way of human life and action. Now, what is really deterministic over here, right? So deterministic basically is a trope, which means that humans react in a particular situation depending upon the circumstances, right? So it kind of shows that deterministic view of human life and of course action. It rejects the traditional convention of drama, right? So as I just spoke about, that not necessarily it would follow that pattern that the traditional drama had in terms of the stage setting, in terms of the props, in terms of the themes, right, in terms of acting, or how the actors are supposed to behave and act, right? It was very different, as a theatrical movement. Also, we bring in Darwinism influenced the naturalist to perceive a person's fate as a product of external forces, right? So again, over here we look at the very idea of fate, and the fate is basically a result of the result of various external elements and forces that are out there in society. Drama and realism. So again, when you talk about realism, it is a form that evolved during the late 19th century and remain present through the post of 20th century. And I believe realism also had to do with representing the everyday, right? And so how then you basically talk about the very nature of the everyday, right? And so again, everyday is something that does not really have to be really grand. It can be ordinary but still very important, still, because again, we tend to miss out on the ordinary and the everyday, right? But then if you look at the 20th century, writings, novels, drama, a lot of them are focusing on the everyday and the everydayness of human conditions, right? So how humans were struggling uh, on the basis, of everyday, life and also everyday existence, addressing the, common problems. Again, the everyday problems and the common problems, that the characters would face. Also, realism had to do with the detailed and comprehensive, portrayal of reality. A very complex ethical decisions are often the subject, matter. So wherein again you bring in the very idea of ethicality and bring in very complex ethical decisions that you have to make as part of the play. Uh, Also, psychologically driven conflict. In terms of drama and realism, and also this form of drama has to do with resistance against the system of social injustice and social disparity, right? So again, you also fight back. Again, if you look at some of these plays where the protagonists and even the other characters, they try to basically fight the social system. Drama and absurdism, right? And this is also again a movement, that took place in the latter half of the 20th century, right? And now, just want to give a clarification that Brecht does not really engage with the idea of absurdism, right? But I just wanted to also explain, drama and absurdism, because it was a very crucial, movement, and this was a movement. So again, you can bring in the Theatre of the Absurd by Martin Aslin, and how this particular period basically spoke about life as something which is really absurd. It does not really make any sense, right? And then, of course, we have Sartre, and he, of course, writes in his work, being in nothingness, that life really does not really, have any grand meaning, and he talks about the very ordinary nature of human existence, and he says that with humans, they are just kind of existing and they're repeating on a things on a daily basis, right? And he says that how with humans, we get up, we get ready, we have breakfast, we have lunch, and then we go to work and we come back for dinner, and then we sleep, and then we repeat this cycle till the time we die, right? Then Sartre, of course, brings in this very idea of what really is the meaning of life and what really is the meaning of our existence. Now, when you talk about this very question of what is the meaning of our existence and what is the meaning of our life, then essentially also it has to do with the two major wars, the First World War and the Second World War, that the humanity had seen in the 20th century, right? So if you again go back to Brecht and then Mother Courage and Her Children, some people may actually critique, Mother Courage for being very, organic about surviving the war. She is somebody who would want maybe at times the war to go on because that helps her sustain, right? But then, that is the again real nature of society, right? And again, over here we see Mother Courage again as as a product of the external forces. She has to react in a particular way because of the external forces. The external forces are too violent, too hostile, and also often we talk about war narratives and women. Something that I'll be talking about in the upcoming slides, where we talk about how women have been at the receiving end in terms of warfare. Like, for instance, if you talk about Russia and Ukraine, there have been human rights violations. Of course, right now also Palestine, what's happening in Gaza and Israel, right? But I remember going through this entire report that spoke about the number of women who were sexually violated, in Ukraine as part of the larger warfare project, right? And I just wonder at times, this very question that, how do women, and of course children, because something that we often don't talk about when we talk about wars, how are they to exist when there is a war going on, right? Are they, resourceful enough to really exist without having to compromise their ethics and morality, because again, in Mother Courage and Her Children, this question of ethics and morality comes up, right? And of course, the very question of virtue, right? So can you retain your virtues and your ethics when there is a war going on, right? Can we afford to be virtuous? I think that is a very, very important question, because I think when there is a war going on, I believe the top priority for anyone would be survival, right? You survive the war, right? So again, with Mother Courage and Her Children, we see that element of survival. But I think I digressed a bit, so I'll just come back. So talking about drama and absurdism, so again, over here we talk about this very meaningless and irrational nature of the world, something that we get to see in Waiting for Godot by Beckett, right? And who is really Godot? I mean, nobody knows, right? I mean, and it's maybe up to us to, make sense of who Godot is. So my version of Godot and my idea of Godot can be very different than your idea of Godot, right? And so I remember teaching this play sometime back, and often when we discuss the play, we also discuss this very idea of waiting, right? And waiting, for a savior to show up and perhaps, bring a closure to the suffering of the world. But the modern world is the world where there are no saviors, where everybody is waiting, for something or the other. And again, that kind of reminds me of, Eliot's The Wasteland, where we have this, Fisher King and this what is this legend? Elthurian legend, if I'm not mistaken. So again, so the king in the wasteland has become impotent because of a certain assault that happened, and now he's waiting for a healer to come. So in the play we have this image of the king who's waiting by the lake all alone fishing, but there are no survivors who really show up when it comes to the savior as such, right? There are no saviors concerning the so-called modern world. And also when you talk about this very idea of of a savior, over here we talk about this loneliness, that you are waiting on your own, you are waiting where you're just all by yourself, right? So again, this idea of waiting for Godot in particular. Also, absurdism has to do with the breakdown of language. So how language then becomes a very important element, right? And very interestingly, even in the Mother Courage and we have multiple names as such for different characters, right? And all right. Now, also over here, we talk about the repetition of mundane and ordinary as part of the absurd drama, and something that happens in The Birthday Party by Harold Pinter, where we have Stanley and we have Meg, we have Pete, these different characters. And if you really follow the conversations of Stanley, Meg, and Pete, they keep repeating the mundane, they keep repeating the ordinary. For instance, Meg would ask Stanley that, okay, how is the tea? And then he'll say the tea is good. And then she'll ask again, oh, is the tea really good? And he'll say, yeah, it's good. And then she'll ask again, is the tea hot enough to be good, right? So how, you basically keep repeating, these very, mundane, meaningless, sentences, which in a way may express or at least represent the very hollow nature of human world, which of course is trying very hard to sustain conversations, and the conversations are failing, right? And people are then adding things for the sake of adding, because there is nothing meaningful to say as such. Now, as I just mentioned, eternal waiting for the savior, but nobody really arrives. And as I said that in the wasteland, we have again a number of people who are waiting, but then the survivors, or the saviors never arrive, and then you just survive on your own, right? And you remain that lone survivor. Also, another theme is expressing tragic, with the comic form. So a lot of times in absurd drama, we have the, representation of the tragic through comic. And I think one example that I can remember is this character from the birthday party called Lulu, and how Lulu is sexually assaulted, you know, uh, in the birthday party, right? So when the birthday party is going on, and then all of a sudden there is a, power cut, and then Lulu gets assaulted, right? And also in the play, Stanley towards the end, his glasses are, he's attacked, his glasses break, and he is taken to some unknown, disclosed, uh, location, undisclosed location, and 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 of course the whole scene is done in a very comic way, but there is nothing comic about it, right? It's very dark, very tragic, right? So how then absurd drama brings all these different elements. Also, this drama involves anti-character, anti-language, and anti-plot. Now, when you talk about Brecht, and now we come to Bertolt Brecht and his work, and so when you talk about his style of writing, uh, he, in fact, is somebody whose work is seen in direct, comparison in terms of the epic theater, right? So again, epic theater is something which has a fractured narrative, and it is non-linear and jumps about in time. So again, if you look at the Mother Courage and Her Children, the timeline, so we see different years pop up, right? Of course, I mean, we are talking about the 30 years war as such, but there is no direct a linear representation of the war, right? So if you look at scene 1, scene 2, scene 3, scene 4, scene 6, right? So they all basically open basically in certain years without any linearity as such, right? So there is this entire subversion of time, right? So how time then becomes in a way secondary. Epic theater engages with a clear political statement, right? So again, talking about the very political nature of epic theater, right? And uh, again, over here, if you look at Mother Courage and Her Children, highly political, right? Because somewhere the play is commenting upon uh, the war that is being fought because of the crisis and conflict of faith, right? And how this war could have been avoided. It should have been avoided, right? But of course it does not happen, right? And how Brecht, while he's going back to 17th century, he's also commenting upon the 20th century, right? Because the play was written in the 20th century, right? And it was published and then performed in the 20th century, right? So wherein we talk about how there was this rise of, a certain party, Nazi regime, and what that regime did to the conditions of humanity, right? Wherein again we talk about there was this direct separation of human body and human beings, right? Something that again I think post-humanism talks about, and it says that the very idea of humans and humanity, it was never really a unified idea, right? So when you say humans and non-humans, even humans is a very heterogeneous category, right? Where, because if you, and I just want to digress for 2-3 minutes and then come back, because if you talk about the idea of a human, again something that we can see in terms of the modern drama, because and modern theater, right, wherein we are trying to represent the human, but the human of course is not a, as I said, holistic universal category. It is not a homogeneous category, right? Because a lot of people And a lot of people even now, who are a part of our world, they don't qualify as humans, right? So for a long time, the black people were seen as subhumans, right? And even now we have fair bit of racism is in America. The Jews were seen as less of a human, right? The white men saw them as the representative figure of absolute complete humanity, right? If you look at the entire I mean Oriental perspective, if you look at colonizers and colonized, the colonized were not seen as humans, right? So the idea of a human is not really a universal idea. That's point number one. Now, again, when you just talk about right that how epic theater was trying to you know talk about the very idea of a human also in a very political sense, and also the very idea of society in a political sense, right? And also in terms of what really are the primary issues that we have to keep in mind. Clearly not a war, right? And clearly not a war in terms of a faith, right? I mean, so while individuals may be allowed or they're free to perform the faith that they want to perform, but to have a war of faith. And again, we have this statement in the play, it was a war of faith, right? And so what faith are we then talking about over here, right? uh, are we talking about faith in terms of humanity? Are we talking about faith in terms of the future of human civilization? Or are we talking about faith in terms of the very nature of faith, right? That it is a war of faith, right? It is a war of faith to protect the faith. It is a war of faith to protect the religion, right? It is a war of faith to protect a certain ideology, right? So again, Brecht wants to comment upon these issues directly and indirectly, and tries to say that, well, I mean, any kind of a war, whether it's a war on faith or a war of faith or war of non-faith, it's not really conducive to human situations and human society. War will bring destruction. War will bring violence. War will bring pain, suffering, sorrow for everybody, irrespective of who are we looking at. Also, over here we talk about the epic theater is about addressing the audience directly. Theatrical movement of the mid 20th century, it was concerned with inspiring the audience to see the world the way it is. Also, we talk about the theatrical, devices. So again, you're telling the audience to see the world the way it really is, right? And try not to conceal and sugarcoat anything. Talking about the theatrical devices, so in this form of theater, we have ironical acting, actors talking to the audience directly, actors told to maintain the difference between the characters that they are playing and who they really are as human beings, right? So you maintain that kind of a difference. Something that again we see is a transition from I don't know, naturalism is there where you would practice your own personal history to perform and bring in that idea of reality. But over here you also break away from that and be the actor that you are, right? And also as part of epic theater, one actor could perform many play many characters. Also, as part of epic theater, we would have exposing props and other set functions, and as I told you, addressing the audience to and directly speaking the stage directions and incorporation of song and the interludes. Right. So again, in with the Mother Courage and the Children, we have a number of songs that are there. Now, also when you talk about alienation effect. Which again is something that is seen in direct relation to the work by Bertolt Brecht, right? And how, he wanted people to remain critical when they're watching a performance, and also try to draw their judgment on the basis of their criticality, and not try to just get lured by the emotions that are being projected, right? So stop the audience from identifying with the characters, right? And what he would do, he would break the fourth wall, right? So again, you try to break the fourth wall and fourth wall basically is the wall, the transparent wall that exists between the people who are on stage and the people who are sitting in the audience, right? And so how Brecht would try to break this wall, so that people can just be cognizant of the fact that it is a performance and not real, right? And I think this kind of reminds me of the play performances that we used to have in JNU. And we had this, KCOAT. And I still remember this is one of those very, interesting memories that I have of watching theater in JNU, where, and JNU is very closely located to Delhi airport. So, and often we would have these evening performances in the open air theater, and the plane would often, cross and the campus, because the airport is not very far from the campus, and the plane is really low, and it creates a lot of sound. So many a times, and it was, I think, the common understanding in GNU that whenever there is a plane, would cross the campus, all the characters will freeze, because in that moment the dialogues are not audible, you cannot hear anything. And they will freeze, and they would wait for the plane sound to kind of go away, the plane to go away, and then the play would kind of resume once again. And I was just amazed in that moment, because I thought, oh, wow, this is alienation effect, where a plane comes, and the whole production stops, and that is when, people kind of break in for their conversations and small chit chat, and the actors are all on pause, and as the plane passes by, and the sound goes away, the play begins again, right? So that I found was very fascinating. So again, talking about alienation effect, it's about actors stepping in and out of characters, direct address again, non-linear narrative, use of placards, to help with further meaning, and forcing the audience to see the performance with a lens of criticality. And alienation effect also is seen as a distancing effect, or estrangement effect, right? So how it allows you a sense of distance as such, or a sense of estrangement. Now, very quickly talking about Brecht, 1898 to 1956, a very important playwright, and he used drama as a social and ideological forum to represent the working class while circulating the ideas, of the left, right? So again talking about, war, and who really suffers when there is a war, right? Talking about, so again, in Mother Courage and Her Children, we have, the peasants and the farmers, and how, they are being robbed, they are being looted, their, domestic, animals are being butchered and being taken away. Many of the farmers are being, slashed to death, and they've been attacked, right? While many of these, poor peasants had nothing to do with the war, right? They had nothing to do with, which, group to support. They were living their life, right? But of course, if you are a Protestant farmer, and if the Catholics come and overtake your town, then there is a very bleak chance of your survival. And the same in the case of a Catholic farmer. And when the Protestants kind of occupy the town, then you have a very bleak chance of survival, right? So it's very interesting, how when you have these wars that are being fought, the people, the ordinary people, the common people, who just want to live their, life, and who just want to focus on their dreams, on their present, and on their future, how they become the victims, right? And again, this line comes up in the play, that it is the common people who really pay, the heaviest of the price, when there is a war going on. It is not the people, who are basically in positions of power, who really have to pay for any kind of a war, because they are, well equipped, right, with all kinds of resources. And I'm trying to find this quote that I had kind of, gone through. Uh, uh, Anyhow, so it is they who really pay the price, and not really, the sergeants and the officers who recruit, right? Uh, Talking about, again, Bertolt Brecht, he represented the disappointment in the civilization after the First World War, right? So again, when you talk about, this very disappointment in the civilization, we can also remember, Dialectic of Enlightenment, the work by, the Frankfurt School, Adorno and Horkheimer, and they basically critiqued the very idea of enlightenment, and they said that, humans claimed to have knowledge and enlightenment to really bring that change, but in a way, humans are not really so enlightened, because what they did in terms of 20th century, in terms of human civilization, is something that no enlightened species would actually do. And very interestingly, when you talk about this very critique of enlightenment, right, and if you see the last point over here, it is a a tool of barbarism, something that Adorno heavily kind of endorsed, and he said that Enlightenment is a failure. I mean, it did not really bring us any happiness. It did not really bring us any sense of order. And also we have this other theorist, Bruno Latour, and there's another work by him, We Have Never Been Modern. And in that work, he says that, how this entire project of modern constitution is basically a hollow project. He says that we have never been modern. So when he says that we have never been modern, he says that, well, I mean, we thought that we are modern and we are moving towards modernity. And of course, with that, we are moving towards, progression and development and scientific innovations and all of that. He says that no, I mean, humans claim to be modern, but they are not really modern, right? Because he says that how with technology came, absolute surveillance. With technology came, absolute, curtailment of human freedom. With science and innovation came, the very compromise that humans now, have to make with their basic human dignity and human right. So he says that is not something that I would say that, that is equivalent to being modern. And therefore he says that we have never been modern. Also, Brecht talks about the anti-bourgeois attitude, something that also comes up, by Osborne in his work. And he says that, the people of the bourgeois, class, bourgeois again is over here, very Marxist term of, working class proletariats, and the bourgeois of, a certain class of privileged aristocrats, who had it easier, right? And he says, so in Look Back in Anger, we have Jimmy comments on Alison's brother Nigel, and he says that, with Nigel, because he comes from a background which has money, he will easily get a job, right? For us, it's very difficult. Also, Brecht was anti-fascist and, anti-Nazism. And in fact, there is a very fascinating reading that some of you can really check by Freud, Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, 1921. And in this reading, Freud talks about the very idea of the mob psychology, the mass psychology, something that was very common during the Nazis regime, right? Hitler's regime, where a lot of Nazis thought in a particular way. There was this mass psychology, and very interestingly, Freud says that a lot of people who may not really have a sense of identity and existence, they gain that identity the moment they become a part of a mass or a mob, right? So the moment you become a part of a mob, it gives you a sense of an identity, because now you're fighting for a particular ideology, fighting for a particular group, for a particular party that, so that makes you feel empowered. But very interestingly, in that very moment of being empowered and feeling very good about yourself, it also gives you a sense of invisibility, in the sense that a mass can do things, kill people, and yet it's very difficult to hold who's accountable, because the moment you are a part of a mass or a mob, it also gives you a sense of invisibility, right? So I hope I'm not confusing people, right? So while it gives you a sense of visibility because you are a part of a mass or a mob, it also gives you a sense of invisibility because you can do things, and the legal, institutions cannot really follow up, because you can disappear after what you do. Also, we have Adorno's work, Aspects of Contemporary Right-Wing Radicalism, and the lecture that he delivered in 1967 to the students of Vienna. And he talks about knowledge, and he says that how knowledge, in fact, in the 20th century was put service to the ruler than really liberation, and I think this sentence may find and resonate with also the contemporary times in which we are living in, where the knowledge is being, used to serve the ruler than really the liberation. The major plays by Brecht are Mother Courage and Her Children, The Life of Galileo, 1943, Mother Courage, 1941, The Good Person of Szechuan, 1943, and The Irresistible Rise of Arturo, 1958. There are other plays as well, but I just wanted to bring some of the plays that he has done. Now, talking about Mother Courage, even though I have been referring to Mother Courage time and again, while discussing various points, and I just want to kind of look at the play in the couple of slides where, as I told you, we have a backdrop of the 30 Years' War between the Catholics and Protestants, 1618 to 1648. And the war began in 1617 when Ferdinand II became the King of Bohemia, and he started to claim the land of the Protestants for the expansion of the church, right? So when the Ferdinand II, King of Bohemia, started to claim Protestant land for the expansion of the church, I think that is when the problem really started. Some of the countries that became a part of this 30 years long war are Austria, Sweden, Denmark, Germany, Poland, Spain, Netherlands, France, etc. Now, the play is about Anna Furling, Mother Courage, trying to survive the war with her three children. And so her three children are her silent daughter Catherine, and her sons Elif and Swiss children. So Elif again is the brave son, as we see, and Swiss cheese is the honest son. So if you look at the virtues over here, right? So we have Catherine. Who's also very, even though she's silent and in the play portrayed as dumb, she is very courageous. Elif is somebody who has that virtue of bravery, and Swiss cheese is somebody who's highly honest. But even though you may have these virtues, these virtues will not come to your rescue when it comes to war, right? So therefore we talk about that. Do you think virtues can save us, right, when there is a war going on? When you talk about the very notion of courage, right, and I'm quoting these lines from scene 1, page 3, where we say that courage is the name, and Anna Furling says that courage is the name they gave me. I drove my cart right through the bombardment of Riga with 50 loaves of bread aboard, right? So again, she has this cart that she's taking around when the war is going on, and she does not care, which faith is trying to rule and govern in which year and which timeline. Because with Mother Courage, it's about driving the cart, it's about selling the goods, it's about trying to make some money and survive, right? Because she knows that if she's going to practice her side, if she is a Catholic, she can be attacked by Protestants. If she tries to be on the side of Protestants, she can be attacked by Catholics. So of course, she really cannot take that risk, right? And in fact, she says that it's high time. We don't really have any choice, anymore, right? And this is when this sergeant, he's trying to ask Mother Courage that, show me your papers, who are you, where do you come from, right? And she says that, I'm just this ordinary woman who's trying to survive, right? And so why are you so inquisitive about who I am? So when you talk about courage, in fact, Aristotle in his work, I don't know how to pronounce that, Nicomachean Ethics, and he basically says that courage has to be seen in direct relation to confidence and fear, right? So, and he says that courage is not only about being confident, is also about having that sense of fear where you decide when to step back. So at times, even stepping back from a situation can be an act of courage. So courage is not only about that you go and fight and you kind of go to the war front and go with an agenda and try to claim your point. At times that can be highly stupid, because that you can actually die, right? Something that happens to Elif, in the play. Elif is taken by the Swedish, as part of the Swedish campaign by the recruiting officer. And so how he was so courageous, where he would go around, killing peasants as told by the officers. He would take away their land, right? But then he was eventually killed, when the regime changed, right? So in one regime he is brave, he is honored. In the other regime, he becomes somebody who's a criminal, right? So it's all about that change of time, right? So even though you say that he's highly courageous, but that courage takes him down. He dies because he does not realize where to draw the line between courage and fear, right? Something that Aristotle says that we need to draw that line between confidence and fear. You cannot afford to be confident all the time. You cannot afford to put your life on stake all the time. At times you need to retreat and just kind of withdraw, and that act of withdrawal can be seen as an act of courage. I just want to bring this point, and the students can research on their own about this further. So Elif is compelled into joining the Swedish campaign in Poland by the recruiting officer, and Mother Courage is saying that no, I don't want my son to really join any war campaign, and so what happens? So the officers start making fun of Elif. They said, oh, maybe you're not a man enough to really join the army, right? So again, this very trope of masculinity which was used to force the young boys to join the army, right? So if you look at the 20th century, if you look at the First World War, Second World War, a lot of young people were literally forced to join the army on the premise that if you join, you will be rewarded, right? And not only that, when you join the army, you become a man, right? Uh, and it just kind of brings this example from Mrs. Dalloway, wherein we talk about Septimus Warren Smith, and Septimus Warren Smith had fairly brave man, represented various regiments, fought the war, came back, but when he came back, he was no longer the same person, right? He was suffering with trauma, PTSD, and a lot of people did not even consider that to be an issue, because to address that you're going through PTSD is to address that you are not a man, right? So again, this very idea that you cannot afford to be vulnerable, because the moment you are vulnerable, your masculinity is it gets distorted. Your masculinity is taken away. So how a lot of young people were given that trope of use the trope of masculinity, that you are not a man if you don't fight the war. And also a lot of these young men were promised that you're going to get women, because women love men who are in the army, and you would be rewarded with women, right? And very interestingly, if you look at the entire war history of Japan, which I'll be talking about very quickly, where they had comfort women, right? And comfort women were the women who were hired, a lot of them from South Korea, Vietnam, also some of the Asian countries, and they were hired on the account that we need women to help us, in terms of the medical services, in terms of the food services, supply services, and a lot of women were recruited, and a lot of women were then forced into this very organized sex slavery. So and they were literally given the term comfort women, and they would have these shifts from particular hours in a day, where the number of soldiers would in fact go and rape these women. Um, and how women, of course, had no agency. A lot of these women, who basically who were forced into comfort women, many of them died by suicide, because they thought that now they cannot really go back to their families, right? And also, so how we have all these different narratives of how women have suffered, as part of the entire warfare and war project. So again, over here, Mother Courage and her children talks about raiding the local peasants, killing and robbing them. So as I told you, we have three characters: silent daughter Catherine, and again in the play, Catherine is attacked, and because of these drunk soldiers attack her, and because of the attack, she has that scar on her face, right? And now Catherine cannot really go, because she is highly conscious of that scar. And in fact, Mother Courage says that a lot of her customers who come to the cart, they go away because they get so scared of Catherine, right? So again, over here, also I want to kind of look at the silent, the dumbness, the muteness of Catherine as highly symbolic, where we talk about that women, a lot of women, of course they participated in the war, but a lot of women suffered silently, right? And what they went through, they could never really talk about, the very idea of silence and invisibility. Of course, Catherine, in the play is somebody who tries, I think it was scene 5, or scene 6, where when the Catholics are, coming, she takes this drum and then she starts, beating the drum, right? And then the army says that don't beat the drum on top of the rooftop because you'll wake up the entire town and everybody will get alerted, right? And she does not listen to anyone. And eventually she's shot by the army because she was beating the drum, while the army was telling her that don't do that because you're going to basically wake up the entire town and they would know that we have come, right? So again, while we see Catherine is silent, she's not really silent, right? Because if you look at the moment of her death, she's fairly audible, right? And then drum, almost takes the voice of Catherine to across houses, homes, and lanes of the town and the city. Mother Courage and her children also talks about raiding the local peasants, which Elif does, and killing and robbing them, taking away their domestic animals, right, and selling them off. In the play, also we have Whitey Pottier. I hope that's the right pronunciation. Yet Pottier, and she's basically termed as a prostitute, in the play. And I just wanted to kind of bring in this very idea of a comfort woman and the very idea of prostitution concerning the war, right? So how a lot of women did not really have any other alternative to survive the war, right? And so how then sex became a way of survival as well as way of sustenance, as well as a way of making some money. But also over here, while I endorse the idea that women who practice prostitution as a profession, they are free to do that, irrespective of war or no war. But however, when you look at war narratives, we often hear of sexual assaults and how sexual assault is used as a weapon during warfares, to take revenge against people, against war groups, war communities in particular. Some of the key issues that we see in the play, of course, the very first issue is war as a commodity. And if you remember the very first slide, I spoke about that war will always find a way, to find its relevance in the society, and war is something that is going to go on forever, right? And there are people who would. So again, these lines I want to kind of quote from the play. They are waging war for Almighty God and in the name of everything that's good and lovely. Scene 3, page 24. But look closer, they aren't so silly. They are waging the war for what they can get, right? So while you say that the war is for the God, to protect the God, the war is for, the faith, but when you look closely, you realize that the war is being fought, by the people to get something, out of, the war, to get what
With,
yes.
sorry for interruption, Omajit.
Yes.
Yes.
You do one thing. I have sent you the email of Elisabetta Marino. You please send the link through in the email, in her email.
All right.
He will join shortly. She will join shortly.
Right. Shall I?
Okay, continue.
Okay. All right. Now, also when you talk about war as a commodity, I think another issue that comes up in the play is, of course, the issue of corruption, right? And war, is something that is, full of corruption. It basically, initiative to really, make something out of it. And in fact, we have these lines from the play, page 35, scene 3. Corruption in humans is same as compassion in God. Corruption is our only hope, and that's something that Mother Courage says. Long as we have it, there will be lenient sentences, and even an innocent man will have a chance of being let off, right? So again, talking about corruption, right? So how corruption was highly rampant, when you talk about the war, right? And also talking about who really is being forced to fight the war, right? So where somebody like Elif is picked up and is basically asked to join the war. And then again we have these lines from 3 to page 15. In decent countries, folks don't have to have virtues. The whole lot can be perfectly ordinary, average, intelligent, and for all I know, coward, right? So again, I mean, talking about that, when there's a war going on, people just can be ordinary. They don't have to have any virtues, right? But then, of course, war often is projected as a kind of a virtue that if you fight the war, I mean, it's going to bring you, the very sense of honor. Also talking about that there are no winners, in a war, and war and suffering of the working class again is something that comes up in the play time and again, as I spoke about. Also, war and the issue of retaining your virtue, as I was talking about, Mother Kare says that we necessarily should not be, retaining, or should not at least have the pleasure with retaining the virtues. We can be flawed, we can be cowards, we can be who we want to be, right? And yet we should not be penalized for who we are, right? Also, when you talk about war in particular, we also talk about violence and how violence is seen as a source of pleasure, and also violence is a tool of making money by many, right? As part of the First and Second World War. And over here, very quickly, I want to bring in the last 3 points, where we talk about war and the question of survival. So do we call surviving, no matter what, on what cost, as an act of courage, right? Because I believe Mother Courage, even though some people may call her, she's being very opportunist at moments, but she doesn't really have an option, right? She has to survive the war. And also being a woman, she has to survive the war. And also talking about a woman who has children, 3 children, so it's very precarious situation that she is in, right? But also when you talk about humans, I just want to bring in the idea of the Anthropocene, wherein we talk about that how humans, while they talk about war and warfare, we only talk about the humans who have died, and the number of people who have died. We never talk about the number of non-humans who have died, the number of animals who have died in terms of a war. Something that Brecht also highlights, in the play, wherein he talks about the horses of the farmers, right? How they are suffering because of the war, right? And also the nature that suffers because of war. Recently, there was this entire, I think, news that depicted the environmental damage that happened in Ukraine because of the war that's going on between Ukraine and Russia. Now, the last 2 slides, and then I'm done. When you talk about war and women, war and working women. So again, the war, of course, brought in all kinds of, issues and problems for women, but also it brought working opportunities. So I didn't want to kind of project war only as something that brought, pain and havoc for women, because a lot of women also, joined the, workforces for the very first time in human history, in the West, in a very formal, organized manner, right? And also, women joined because the men did not have an option, because they needed people to work, to create, uniform for the soldiers, or to work in the field of, medicine, and help the wounded soldier, all of that. So again, we have this essay by Susan Pycroft, which of course is titled British Working Women and the First World War, which talks about the working women who joined, basically the war in a very indirect way. So a lot of them became the part of the war, where they were helping, the war to sustain. Then we have this another essay by Chonge Sara Song, from Imperial Gifts to Sex Slaves, theorizing symbolic representation of the comfort women, where she talks about that how while war brought in the working conditions for women, it also brought in sex crimes. And I just spoke about what all working comfort women had to go through. Also, I'm just going to just quickly wind up in about 5 minutes. So war, and of course the issue of agency then becomes very important in terms of also mother courage, where the agency of the women is often violated. War and absolute disregard for humanity, women as commodity and good, Again, we see in Mother Courage where women are treated as a commodity, and women as the pie. Again, that's the term which actually means good, a term that was used by Japanese people to address the comfort women. And even though the term has its roots in Chinese language, right? And also how war had to do with manipulation. So how a lot of women were asked to join the war, but many of them were also forced into sexual slavery. Now, when you talk about war and capitalism, this is just war theory that talks about that every war should have some ethics and morals, right? So war should not really have human rights violation. You should not really sexually assault women. You should not really attack children. You should not really attack animals. You should not really attack civilians. But we know that it never happens, right? I mean, when there is a war, no ethics are really followed. But just war theory talks about the very idea of ethicality, that you have to retain this very idea of ethic when there is a war going on. When you talk about war and capitalism, again we talk about who's making the laws and who's making the policies. Again, we go back to the question
Ved,
of...
actually,
Yeah?
our next speaker has joined, so you went up within a minute or so.
Okay, all right. So again, we talk about war as an ongoing transaction, and war to sustain economies, right? And war is about retaining control and power, and also war is about the subversion of human rights in particular, right? So again, we have to see war in a way, I'm done, thank you, in a way where it sustains the very capitalist system through which
So, thank you, Ved Prakash, for your very engaging and very elaborative, engaging, full of informations and thought-provoking lecture. So now we'll move on to our next speaker. She has joined from
Thank you.
the University of Rome, Professor Elisabetta Marino. Ognivo, are you, ma'am? How are you? After a long gap of, after Corona, we are now in the
after coronavirus. Now we're okay. We're okay. We are back to our normal life.
Yes, ma'am. So, Ognivo, are you here?
Yes, I'm here, Dr. Mondo.
So, okay, you please introduce Professor Marino.
On behalf of the academic community of Shidokano University, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Elisabetta Marino. Professor Marino is an associate professor of English literature at the University of Rome, Tor Vergata. She's also the head of Asia and the West, which is an international research center based at the University of Rome. Professor Marino is a prolific author, having written 4 monographs, including works on Tamilian in British and American literature, an introduction to British Bangladeshi literature, a study on the relationship between Mary Shelley and Italy, as well as an analysis of romantic dramas on mythological subjects. In addition to her monographs, she has edited and co-edited 8 collections of essays and has published on travel literature, Asian American and Asian British literature, as well as Italian American literature. Professor Marino has published extensively on the English Romantic writers, particularly Mary Shelley and P.B. Shelley. Today she'll be talking about Horace Walpole and the beginning of the Gothic tradition. Please join me in welcoming Professor Marino to our online session. Professor Marino, over to you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to apologize with the previous speaker because, the end of his really intriguing speech was a bit abrupt, and I'm sorry for that. But I have time limitations, unfortunately, because I have to go to university in 1 hour. So our colleague was so kind as to allow me to speak immediately. So I would like, first of all, to thank you for the invitation. It is always a pleasure to share ideas with you. And I hope I will see you in flesh. I was in India in February, and I am planning to go back to India in December. So maybe we could arrange a lecture or something. It would be absolutely wonderful.
Ma'am, when you will come, I will invite you to be to my college also.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. You're always so hospitable and so
pleasure for us to invite you to Purulia.
Wonderful. Thank you. So, as mentioned, today's topic will be the beginning of the Gothic tradition. the Gothic tradition began in the 18th century, which is a century that is normally associated with enlightenment, rationality, planning, classical literature. So when I introduce Gothic literature to my students, they are always a bit puzzled because they are used to associating this century with rationality. It is the century of Locke, it is the century of all the French intellectuals, it's the century of the French Revolution. But like in every phenomenon, when there is something that goes in one direction, there is always something that goes in the opposite direction. And when I try to explain to them why the Gothic was born precisely in this period, I always try to show them that when there is a very bright side, sometimes this side is too bright because it has to hide a darker side. So phenomena are always twofold. A century normally characterized by rationality hides darkness, hides shades and shadows. It is the same that happens when in our mind we always try to be hyper-rational, and we do it when we are afraid. So when we are afraid that something dark may happen, then we become rational. We try to simplify things, to organize things. Sometimes we have the need to get everything ready, organized. Even in our desk, when we have to work, we try to tidy up, because by tidying up the desk, we think that we can tidy up also our mental space. And this is exactly what happens in the 18th century, which is a century in which Britain consolidated also the foundations and the premises of the colonial empire. Because we think of the colonial empire in the Victorian age, but the 18th century was mandatory, was extremely important, because the East India Company, which had its headquarters in Calcutta, strived to establish a stronger control over what until those days and years were merely commercial colonies. So in the 18th century, they tried to transform what were commercial colonies into political colonies. And it's also the century in which the Black Hole of Calcutta, which is a portable nightmare for every British person, occurred. In the Black Hole of Calcutta, as you are probably aware of, basically there was a rebellion against the East India Company, and the people of the East India Company that had their fort were forced into one little room that was basically 5 meters by 5 meters, and there were over 100 people inside that, and they died. 90% of them died because they suffocated for lack of air. So that became a nightmare. That became the dark side of the bright project of colonialism. So from an historical point of view, from an intellectual point of view, and then, as we will see, from a literary point of view, the 18th century is characterized by brightness, but also too much brightness that has to push away the darkness that also characterized the period. Now, let's first of all focus on the term Gothic. Why Gothic novel? Gothic simply meant anti-classical, anti-orderly, organized, symmetrical way of conceiving things. So Gothic was not really related to Gothic environments and therefore to Germany, but it was meant as a synonym for anti-classical. And believe it or not, the Gothic began not in literature, but in the architecture of gardens. And I will explain to you why. I don't know whether anybody of you has been to Europe, but if you have been to Europe, to France, to Paris, or to Rome, you will see that there are a lot of beautiful villas, beautiful palaces, which are absolutely symmetrical. Okay, there is somebody who has raised his hand. Papi Chand. No, maybe it was a mistake. Okay, so if you see, for example, Versailles, the Palace of Versailles, where the kings and the queens of France lived, that is beautiful, that is full of grandeur, it's perfectly symmetrical, and the gardens are absolutely manicured, because according to the classical principles, nothing had to be out of place. Everything had to be orderly and organized. So, in opposition to this, in the 18th century, some architects of gardens began to build what came to be known as English gardens. So not the classical French or Italian gardens, but the English gardens, which were the outcome of a contamination of heterogeneous materials. So, in an English garden, symmetry is banned. Nature is left more or less wild. There are bushes, there are unforeseen, for example, little falls, heaps of rocks. Maybe, since it was also connected with the tradition of the Grand Tour, in an English garden you could find a block belonging to an antique temple that had been smuggled from Italy into England. So it was some kind of bizarre, heterogeneous, not foreseeable garden, and absolutely not symmetrical. This English garden came to be known also as a Gothic garden. So it was not reassuring as an Italian, a French, a classical garden in which you knew everything. You knew exactly where to place things. There was harmony. It was relaxing. No, the Gothic or English garden had as its main goal the one to stir astonishment, the idea of astonishment, looking at things that are unforeseen, surprising the viewer. And from the architecture of gardens, in more or less about 1750, 1754, this idea of astonishing, surprising, stirring emotions and physical reaction into the viewers or into the readership passed to literature. So, Gothic as an anti-classic was born in the architecture of garden, and in the middle of the century, it was transferred, this idea of astonishment, of stupor, of surprising through bizarre architectural elements, passed through it from it to literature. So it is not a literary movement, but it passed to literature. Now, before delving into Horace Walpole, I also have to give you some philosophical grounding, a philosophical framework for the Gothic novel. The philosophical framework was provided by Edmund Burke with this very famous essay, and I am sure you're all familiar with it, on the sublime and the beautiful. In this essay, Burke tried to establish and to synthesize all the elements that create beauty as against all the elements that create sublime, which is connected with the idea of astonishment. So, in this essay, you read that whatever is beautiful is small, but not too small, is graceful, is symmetric, is fair in its color, it's predictable, it is smooth, and it has its main effect, the effect of relaxing the viewer. Burke makes an example to explain this principle, also contemplating the beauty of women. If you think of the canonical ideas of beauty, a woman that is beautiful is proportioned. She's not too tall or too short. She's average height. She has got smooth skin. Her colors are fair because, especially in Western culture, the idea of a beautiful woman was always associated with a blonde, blue-eyed, fair-complexioned woman with straight, smooth hair. And the hands and the feet are delicate and small. You don't consider beautiful in the past as well as in the present a woman who's got huge hands or massive feet. She would not be considered graceful enough. On the other hand, sublime is something that exceeds the normal proportions, something that the human mind has a difficulty to grasp and hold. It is connected also with the ideal of sublime concocted by Immanuel Kant, the philosopher. To explain the sublime, Kant made reference to a starry night. If you contemplate the sky during a starry night, you are somehow overwhelmed because the sky is never ending. You cannot grasp it in your mind. You cannot control it. It's something that overwhelms you with its grandeur, with its huge proportions. So if you compare the sublime and the beautiful, the sublime is exceeding what you normally can conceive. It is dark, while the beautiful is fair. It is big in proportions, and the effect that it has on men's and women's imagination is astonishment, wonder, and admiration. And the body is not relaxed, but it is tense. The idea of tension, because you don't know what to expect. When you contemplate a starry night, you begin to think of yourself as a particle, a little tiny atom within a huge, never-ending universe. So it gives you also anxiety, not the idea of relaxation that it gives you whatever is beautiful, because you feel that you are nothing in this huge universe. And Burke also spoke about gradations of sublime. The most horrific, because it is connected also with the idea of horror, the most horrific is depth. If you think of something that really scares you, could be a well, a pit, a ravine, something that you get lost into, or something that is too tall that you cannot reach the top. So mountains, for example, or a vast plain with no borders, like, for example, the poles, the North Pole, the South Pole. And it is not a chance that Coleridge, with the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, set the story near the southern pole. And it is not a chance that Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is also set in a sublime setting, because we have the North Pole at the beginning and the end of the story. Then we have the meeting between the creature and Victor Frankenstein in the Alps. And the Alps are characterized by high peaks, but also deep gorges. So that is a typical sublime environment. So, having said so, and having created the framework, Horace Walpole used all these elements to invent a new kind of novel. The 18th century is the century of novels. We have Robinson Crusoe, for example, by Daniel Defoe. We have Richardson's Pamela. We have Fielding. So the novel normally is characterized by the idea that what you are reading is the mirror image of reality. So the story of Robinson Crusoe is the story of any potential colonizer, is the story of any merchant. And the writers are at pains to delineate and to specify all the details of their protagonists so that they could be actually real life people. For example, Robinson Crusoe begins with the date of birth, the place of birth. Everything is ready for the reader to be read and absorbed. The reader has not to exercise his imagination. So, what Horace Walpole did is mixing elements of the novel, so lifelike elements, with elements that are purely imaginative, that belong to the tradition of the romance. And therefore, in the Gothic novel, you find supernatural elements, you find settings that are wonderful or very distant from our daily life. So there is a powerful mixture between lifelike elements and completely invented elements that have the goal of surprising, astonishing the reader. Obviously, Horace Walpole was perfectly aware that he was breaking the tradition of the novel. He was contaminating novels and romance, which was an extremely daring experiment. So he was at the beginning of his literary career. He was a wealthy person because he was connected with the political establishment. Therefore, he did not write for money, but he wrote because he wanted to be famous. He wanted fame. He wanted to be remembered in centuries. And that's, the fact that we are talking about him today implies that he achieved his goal in his life. So, Horace Walpole wanted fame, literary fame, but he was also very well aware of the fact that he was breaking a tradition. Therefore, instead of venturing into the literary arena in a naive way, he sort of found a different possibility through which he could use his own original ideas without exposing himself too much. So he pretended that he had found an old Middle-Age manuscript, that he had transcribed it, and he had changed some of the oldest expressions that would not be understood by a current day reader, changed them into a more modern language. So he pretended that he was not the author of what came to be known as the Castle of Otranto. His absolutely fantastic and groundbreaking masterpiece. So he wanted to be cautious because had his experiment not proved successful, he would not have spoiled his career as a writer, because he could always have said, this is not my manuscript, this is somebody else's manuscript, I only updated the language, transcribed it, and made it available to everybody. So in the first of the two prefaces of the Castle of Otranto, you see and you read exactly this kind of disclaimer. This is not my text. The text proved to be extremely successful. People were refreshed by Horace Walpole's new ideas of a novel. And therefore, since he was comforted by the success that he received, he decided to republish the text. We are in 1754, 1755. He decided to republish the text under his own name. 1 year later, explaining why he was so cautious at first, and explaining clearly what his intention was, mixing novel and romance, thus creating a fresh, original, new genre, which is the Gothic genre. So, the Gothic, initiated by Horace Walpole, started a tradition which later on transformed. But in the Gothic set by Horace Walpole, we have a set of characters, a setting that is recurring. We have a lot of reassuring elements, because it is true that Gothic novels were meant to give you goose pimples and create tension, create anxiety, but a pleasant anxiety. But at the same time, it was an extremely relaxing genre. And I will explain to you, because it seems like a paradox, but it's not. I am sure that some of you like, for example, horror movies, and we all watch horror movies for the thrill that the horror movies gives us. But horror movies are also relaxing in the sense that we know it is a movie and it is not reality. And in 99% of the cases, unless there is a sequel like Nightmare 1, Nightmare 2, Nightmare 3, Nightmare 4, and whatever, we know that the good people will be rewarded and the bad people will be punished. So the Gothic novel gives you anxiety, the pimples and whatever, but also it is an extremely moral setting, because we know that unlike life, because in life this is not always the case. Sometimes the villain gets away with it. Sometimes the hero or the heroine die in real life. In a Gothic novel, this never happens. So in a Gothic novel, the villain is always punished and the good people are always rewarded. So it was a genre that could be cathartic, because you could project onto the anxiety that you could read of your own anxiety, knowing that in the end there would be an happy ending. So people were very much into this genre for this very reason. And the Gothic genre moved along set lines. In the Gothic of Horace Walpole, we find a set of characters, a specific time, and also a setting that is recurring, and I will explain to you. Let's start with the characters. In the characters, we always find at least three main characters. We find the heroine, who is normally young, beautiful, blonde, blue-eyed, fair, delicate, absolutely attractive. The heroine of a Gothic novel is never ugly. Then we find a hero, who is obviously the male counterpart. So the hero is attractive, the hero is bold and valiant, proud, young, is courageous, so all the good qualities that we can think of. And then we find the villain, who is the opposite of the hero. The villain normally is in love or is obsessed by the heroine. So you find this triangle, you find the villain, the hero, and the heroine. The villain is always defeated, and the villain normally belongs to a culture that is not British. The villain normally is Italian, and I will explain to you why the villain is Italian or Spanish, or the villain is Oriental, and I use consciously the term Oriental because I am actually connected with Edward Said's Orientalism as a construction of otherness. So by saying Oriental, I want to indicate the fact that he is non-European. So whatever is non-European was lumped together as Oriental to indicate the otherness of the villain. So together with these three stock characters, we also find side characters. For example, there is always a comic pair, and also in the Castle of Otranto, there are some comic and humorous passages because they served the purpose of releasing the tension when the tension was too much. So they had to lower the level of tension. So these are the stock characters. The setting is connected with the figure of the villain. So it's either Spain, Italy, or the Orient. But let me explain to you why. Italy and Spain are two countries which are joined by the fact that are both Catholic countries. And you're very well aware of the fact that in 1534, Henry VIII, with the Act of Supremacy, dictated the separation of the Church of England from the Church of Rome. In theory, because the Church of Rome was too corrupt and he wanted to get married again. But this is just an excuse, obviously. The real reason why Henry VIII separated from Rome is the fact that the Pope was draining all the money from all the Catholic countries of Europe to build all the beauties that we have in my city. All the cathedrals, St. Peter's, all the churches, all the monuments were built with the money of all the Catholics of Europe. And Henry VIII thought, why should I give money to the Pope if I can invest this money into colonial ventures? So, from 1534 onward, whatever was Catholic was considered as the enemy. So it is obvious that the castle of Otranto is set in Otranto, which is a city in Apulia. Or if you take The Monk, 1895, by Matthew Gregory Lewis, which is another very important Gothic novel, The Monk is set in Spain. Spain is another important Catholic country. It's the country of the Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition. So the enemy is the Catholic, and the villain is always a Catholic. Why the Orient? When I started off my talk, I spoke to you about the black hole of Calcutta. The Orient, India, but also Arabia, also whatever was far away from the British imagination, was connected with mysterious lands of opportunities, but also lands where crimes could occur, where the British could be killed, where horrible things could happen, like in the black hole of Calcutta. So the Orient and the Oriental villain are also among the recurring figures. The time. So we spoke about the characters, we spoke about the setting, and now let's talk about the time. The Gothic novel is always set in the past. Could be the Middle Ages, like in the Castle of Otranto, but could be even our more recent past. But the important thing is that it is set in the past. And this is easily explainable if we take into the consideration the relaxing factor that I told you was the other side of the Gothic thrill. So if something is set in the past, it means that it is gone, done with, over. Okay? Had it been set in the present, it could pose a threat to the stability of current day readers. Whereas, if you read something related to a more or less remote past, this will help you to say, okay, the thrill belongs to an epoch that is distant from mine, so I am safe. So, faraway country, Catholic or Oriental, stock characters with recurring elements, and in the past, so that the reader could feel reassured that whatever was happening in the novel could not affect his or her normal life. Now, since time is almost up, I just want to project what we have said onto the following century. Because the Gothic tradition began in the 18th century, but it also continued later on. But it transformed, it metamorphosed, like all literary genre. At the end of the 18th century, the Gothic novel began to be contaminated with romantic plots. Better, there were romantic plots, because also in the Castle of Otranto there are romantic plots, but they are secondary. I mean, the important thing is the thrill, then there is the more romantic element. Since writers realized that among their readers many were women, they began to develop more the romantic aspects. So a bit of thrill, but a lot of romance. And so we have, for example, Clara Reeve with The Old English Baron, which is ascribed to the category of romantic Gothic. So it is a Gothic that mixes the thrill with a lot of romance. Then the Gothic changes again, and it changes again with Anne Radcliffe at the turn of the century. Anne Radcliffe exploited some of the elements of the classic Gothic. For example, in Anne Radcliffe's text, there is always or virtually always an Italian setting. If you think, for example, of the Sicilian Romance, which is a very important text by Anne Radcliffe, or another Gothic novel entitled The Italian, in which the Italian of the title is the villain, obviously. But Anne Radcliffe inserts some new element into the Gothic tradition. And these elements will be developed later on by Conan Doyle at the end of the 19th century with the detective fiction. So Anne Radcliffe introduces elements of detection and rational elements into the Gothic plot. So we speak about rational Gothic, because whatever we see, even, I don't know, apparitions, ghosts, things that normally could or would not expect in a normal daily life, are actually explained from a rational point of view. For example, I don't know, one of the paintings that seems to be alive, and it could seem a supernatural element, in actual fact is not supernatural, because behind this painting there were two holes and there was a person that was spying on the others. So the eyes of the painting were not really the eyes of the painting, but were the eyes of a normal person. So you introduce into the Gothic plot elements of rationality. So you see that the Gothic evolves. And the Gothic evolves also into science fiction. The two genres are contaminated, for example, in Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Why do I say that Frankenstein is not properly a Gothic novel, but it's in between Gothic and science fiction? Because there is the setting. The setting is mostly the Alps, Gothic settings, the Sublime, the Italy also, because the family of Victor Frankenstein lived in Italy. Italy is mentioned a lot of times into the text, but there is not the happy ending. So the happy ending that was typical of Horace Walpole's Gothic vanishes into blurred or puzzling or dubious endings, like the ending of Frankenstein. So the Gothic tradition, which somehow was rational, so even though it gave voice to the irrational side of the 18th century, it was rational in a way that it was perfectly organized with a set of characters, with a predictable setting, with a predictable ending. So it was at the same time not predictable and predictable. But these aspects changed later on, and the Gothic assumed different forms. It metamorphosed in different genres, and from the Gothic stems the tradition, for example, of the sensation novel, which is another genre that became very popular in the 1860s, which drew on the Gothic because of the settings, the castles, Italy, but at the same time transformed the Gothic to reflect current day anxieties. For example, in the sensation novel, the setting is in the present, not in the past, to indicate that problems may arise also in our life. And another difference between the Gothic and the sensation novel is the heroine, because while the heroine of the Gothic is always good, pure, beautiful, in the sensation novel, this pure, beautiful, apparently immaculate lady is sometimes the real offender. So the villain and the heroine coincide to pose questions on femininity that in the 18th century, when the Gothic novel began, were not questions that anybody could pose to himself or herself, because women still were relegated to an ancillary position. So I really hope you enjoyed the lecture. We've got 10 minutes for questions, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Marino. So I request our participants to ask questions and any queries.
If you have curiosities, things that you would like to ask, I will also leave you in the box, in the chat box, my email address, so that if you have questions in the future or if you want to contact me, I'm always available. No questions. Come on. Oh, yes, please.
Partho, you have raised your hand.
Oh,
Do you have a question for Professor Marino?
No, not a question in that way, but one observation, that is that, in 18th century, the tradition started, and was it a kind of reaction to the realistic novels, the social novels that came into, at that moment, it was a time of, plenty of novels writing. So was it a reaction to that as well? Horace Walpole wanted to be famous in a different way, other than his contemporaries?
Yeah, basically, as I tried to explain at the beginning of my talk, yes, the standard 18th century novel was very popular, but somehow all these novels were all the same. Okay, they all began with the place of birth, the date of birth, the family of the protagonist, and then they developed always in the same way. So Horace Walpole wanted to create something new, wanted to give his readership some new food for thought, reflecting and pondering at the same time on the dark side of a century that, yes, it expressed the colonial drive of Britain, but at the same time, this colonial drive also had its downsides because things like the Black Hole of Calcutta occurred, and colonialism was not always successful. In the 18th century, the American colonies were lost. So colonialism had its own question marks. And Horace Walpole and whoever followed into his footsteps wanted to reflect and ponder on this very ambiguity of the century. Yes, so exactly this. Thank you for the question and the observation. Any other curiosity? Things that you would like to ask?
I think there is nothing to ask because the lecture was very, pinpointed and to the point, and you explained everything with a lot of examples. And always it is very nice to listen to you, Professor Marino. So thank you very much on behalf of our the Department of English and other departments of two other colleges. So thank you that you.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure to be with you anytime. Okay, and I hope next time in flesh. Thank you.
Right, my regards.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.